1, 2, 3. Did you hear me? Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us here tonight. My name is Elena Racheva. I'm a bookseller at Pushkin House Bookshop, and our today's talk is also related to a book called The Outbreak, an Unknown History of HIV in the USSR, which recently was published in by Individuum in Russian, and it sheds a light on largely untold chapter of Soviet history. So I'm very happy, extremely happy to see the two authors of this book. And let me introduce, please. So our today's speaker, just a second. No, fine. So Irina Roldugina is a historian whose work brings to life the complex social fabric of Russian past. And Irina earned her PhD from the University of Oxford and has taught at the University of Pittsburgh in the USA. And Irina currently is a research fellow at the University of Bristol. And Irina's research spans social history and the history of sexuality, with a particular focus on early modern and Soviet Russia. And Katerina Suverina is a cultural studies scholar and historian whose research delves deeply into memory studies, historical trauma, and the medical humanities. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Constance in Germany and a co-founder of the February Journal. And Katerina's work of the cultural history of HIV in the late USSR and contemporary Russia is essential for understanding how narratives around disease and society are shaped and remembered. And guiding our conversation tonight is Andrei Zavadsky, who brings a rich interdisciplinary perspective to our discussion. Andrei is a postdoctoral research associate in the Institute of the Art and Material Culture at TU Dortmund University, and is associate member of CARMAH at Humboldt University in Berlin, and also co-founder editor of the February Journal. So his work spans memory studies, museum and media studies, and public history with a focus on Eastern Europe. So thank you to everyone for coming. So, welcome.
Yes, thank you for the introductions, and a warm welcome to you all. And thank you very much for your interest in this important book, and for coming here. I hope you will not spend a summer evening in vain. I'm delighted to be here, especially because as a longtime friend and collaborator of one of the authors, Katya, I've been hearing about this book for quite a while. So it's a wonderful opportunity now to be able to talk about it and talk about it publicly in front of you all. I think I would like to kick off this discussion by asking you the following question. I mean, we've already heard, and everybody, the book can be bought downstairs, and everybody saw that it is in Russian. It is published, you have decided to publish it in Russian, to publish it in the genre of non-fiction, even though it is based on serious scholarship, and to publish it in a Russian publishing house. It feels like a very conscious decision to me. Could you explain that, please?
No. Well, I've started to interested in the topic of HIV/AIDS and the history of HIV/AIDS in the 2020, and at the time I worked in the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, And we decided that we can do something with this topic because there were no information, I mean like general public information about HIV/AIDS, and I started to collect materials. And once I found a very nice article in Kommersant newspaper, quite popular newspaper, which said like Russian Duma did not find anything Russian in HIV. So, and I understand that it was a kind of a also political topic, yeah. And the director of the Garage Museum asked us to find people who are specifically artists who are involved in the topic of HIV/AIDS, who can represent HIV/AIDS, and we failed. We didn't find anyone, and I started asking myself why. So, and we established kind of a small group of people who decided to go to the archives and digging into papers and trying to find an information what's happened. And I also was involved in the process of creating a podcast on HIV/AIDS, and it was also a part of this. And it somehow became a really important topic for me because I realized that we have in Russia we have an enormous stigma attached to the virus and to the people with HIV, and we do not have any public conversation, and of course we do not have any history connected to HIV. So that's why it was my kind of a motivation to write something about this and to write something popular, or to write, at least to use a language which can be digestible and understandable for the broader audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Pushkin House, for having us, and thank you, Liana, for organizing this event, and thank you for coming. Not just coming, but paying £15. So yeah, I appreciate. Very generous. How did I start thinking about this book? Well, I'm an archival nerd. I love archives. So this book for me started with an archival work in the Russian State Archive in Moscow, like many years ago, maybe 6 years ago. I was working on a completely different topic on the 1920s, 1930s. This is like my the book is in the pipeline. The book about the queer emancipation in the early Soviet Union. And to relax my brain, I guess, at some point I decided browsing Garf catalog. And I found letters. Well, so I inserted different terms, different words, and one of the words was HIV. And I found quite many interesting sources. One of the sources were letters written by ordinary Soviet citizens to the different branches of the authorities, to the newspapers, to the magazines about the HIV threat. And I thought, well, it's kind of very interesting source. I love letters as a source. Yeah, that's how I think it started. I did a presentation, I guess, at ACES, the biggest Slavic conference in the States, and the response was very positive because indeed, as Katya just said, the history of HIV has not been written yet, and our book is just the beginning. I know that you are expected to hear from the author that, okay, we wrote a book, like, yeah, the project is finished, but actually it's just the first step. I'm pretty sure that we will see avalanches of books and articles related to this topic. However, of course, there are certain limitations, and in terms of the sources, I guess, and the access to the sources, we are in a very problematic position right now, because even some of the sources I worked with a couple of years ago, they are classified again in Russia, especially the sources related to homosexuality, even in the late 80s. So yeah, so I guess we can talk about it in detail. About the sources. So yeah, and then I guess Lena who is here in the auditorium, she told me that Katya is also working and Garage is collecting, Garage, huge institution, very rich institution at the time. They were collecting sources related to HIV, and Elena, introduced me to Katya, and we decided to merge, I guess, our effort and to write something. I think that we immediately decided to write the book aimed at general public, because I guess subconsciously we knew that we are quite limited in time. And indeed, I guess that, so this book was written a year ago, and now I doubt that it would be possible now, you know, to sign the contract to write this book. So yeah, yeah, that's pretty much the story of yeah, birth of this book.
Thank you. Katya, could we start with some basic facts? When was HIV discovered in the Soviet Union? What was the authorities' first reaction to this? And then maybe on another sort of on another path, what did it mean for a Soviet person to learn that they have HIV?
Maybe we can ask these questions together, but regarding the medical history of the HIV/AIDS, so epidemiology was classified in the Soviet Union. If the person is working for an epidemiological department and specifically working with such with the new kind of viruses and mortal viruses, so most of the documents that related to medical sphere were classified or had a kind of a stamp which said for inner use. I mean, like they can only be used inside the Ministry of Health mostly, and. We discovered in one of the documents there was a report written by the director of the Institute of Virology, Viktor Zhdanov. He wrote a report in 1985 and said that the two researchers at this institute diagnosed two persons. One of them was a girl, and we know from some kind of other sources that the girl contracted the virus in the 1970s, but we don't know. We don't have a primary resources which said like I don't know, the blood transfusion was made at that time. So, and this is how it started. So, but in particular, the dissident and also researcher and immunologist Medvedev in his articles and kind of said that so the girl was the first one, and because of because of this procedure of the blood transfusion that was made in around in the middle or in the late 1970s. And the second one was a man who had a Kaposi sarcoma, and actually at the first conference in Atlanta in 1985, Soviet Union presented these results. It was presented by the young and very promising immunologist Haitov, who later became a director of the Institute of Immunology. But we conducted, I and my colleague from the Garage Museum, we conducted an interview with this person, and he said that in the title of his paper, he put a question mark. And it was, and he did it consciously, because when he came back from the States, the party members called him to give an explanation why he did it, why he said that there were cases of the HIV in the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union was quite afraid of opening secrets, opening the information about HIV/AIDS, and this question mark saved the career of this guy, because he explained the party functionaries that he said during the conference that they did not know, but at the same time he said all the necessary information for people who don't understand what virology or immunology is. Yeah, and but I think it's really important if you can tell about this, the first publicly kind of a publicly exposed case. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that everybody knows, and even the new series about the early stages of HIV. I think the series. I do not remember the title. The first patient, zero patient, right? The creators of this series, they featured the Soviet homosexual man, translator, as the so-called zero patient. But as Katya just said, we found archival evidence demonstrating that actually there were two people, and I'm not sure who was this man. Was he the translator or the other one? But there was also a girl, and she obviously was, I think that she was exposed to HIV through blood transfusion. But what is important is that officially the first Soviet patient with HIV is a homosexual man. And the first article about this case was published in 1987, by Pokrovsky, the Pokrovsky Jr., right? And I think it's not just a coincidence. I think that he was deliberately exposed as the first, obviously as the first confirmed case, because he was a homosexual, and it was of course mentioned in the piece written by Pokrovsky. But obviously Pokrovsky at the time, he knew that this was not the case. And I think it's kind of very important because we can draw parallel with the States. In the States, the zero patient was also a homosexual man. And there are many books and articles, well, at least one book and many articles dedicated to this case. And scholars, medical practitioners, and historians and scholars, all of them actually, they argue that the whole idea, the concept of zero patient is invalid. And we should not use it for many reasons. It's invalid in terms of science, in terms of ethical standards. There is no zero patient, I guess. That's the main thing. Also, as I said before, I'm an archival nerd, but for this book, I conducted the first interview in my life with a living person. It's an interview with Gennady Rashubkin, who was a gay man living in the late 1980s. And he was the patient number, as he told me, the patient number 81, officially HIV positive Soviet man. So yeah, he told me a lot about his experience of being gay man living with HIV in the late Soviet Union, and there is a whole chapter based on his interview in the book. So.
But if we were to draw some, I don't know, to sort of maybe generalize what happened to a Soviet person when they discovered they were HIV positive, what would you say? What did it mean for a person?
The end. Basically, seriously, I mean, I found that there is a collection of letters which was published in a very controversial newspaper, which is called Speed Info, and it was established by a very famous and at that time young journalist Vladimir Posner and a very young and promising immunologist Vadim Pokrovsky, or Pokrovsky Jr. Yeah, and his father was the president of the Medical Academy of Science. So, and in this newspaper, this newspaper regularly published letters from people who were diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, and some of them were it's devastating reading. And they usually, and there are, I think there were 4 interviews that was also published by Soviet newspapers, and mostly people talked about their not a nice experience with local doctors if they were diagnosed in the, I don't know, not in Moscow, somewhere else. And at that time, and I'm talking about 1988, 1989, there was only one proper center for HIV people, and it was situated in Moscow in the second hospital, most of the people who shared their experience, they said that they received threats, they were fired, their children were abandoned from schools, and it was kind of a general picture. Yeah, but for people from the, I don't know, not from Moscow, let's say, yeah, and so I collected lots of these stories.
I would answer differently to this question because I as I said, I interviewed Gennady Rashupkin, and he told me that when physicians told him about his HIV positive status, he told me that he was kind of relieved, terrified of course, but also relieved, because he told me, well, and I think that you can find this quotation in the book, he told me, well, I thought, okay, I will die young, I will not be old gay man whom I despise, whom I saw on pleshkas, okay, then I have to live quickly with joy, right? Being positive, and because I will be dead in a couple of years or months. So, and also, what is interesting, he mentioned that he received quite sympathetic attitude from the doctors, from Pokrovsky. He told me that medical staff were in general very sympathetic. And he told me that one of the reasons for that is that the first wave of HIV positive people were mostly gay people. Obviously, they were young, they were attractive, they were, I don't know, talkative, and unlike people who followed, for example, drug addicts, people who were in a different physical, obviously, condition. So yeah, and he told me that he told me that they were partying with nurses, and it was kind of fun experience in the late 1980s, and of course it changed abruptly in the 1991, 1992, when HIV spread further and drug addicts were being hospitalized, and of course the picture had changed. So yeah, I guess that in thinking about experience of being HIV positive in the late 1980s, we have to remember that this experience was very diverse. And again, I interviewed just one person. I wish I could interviewed more people, women, right, and people of different social background and professional background. But you can imagine how difficult it is to conduct interviews now in Russia with people who lived at in the late 1980s. First of all, many of them died. Secondly, not all of them want to speak publicly, or not even publicly, but with a scholar. So that there are so many obstacles in researching this topic, obviously, and there will be even more, I guess, in the next couple of years.
Thank you. When reading the book and preparing for this evening, I thought that, so my impression was that in the first years of the spread of HIV in the Soviet Union, there were two sort of forces, interconnected forces, but not always aligned with each other, that kind of determined to a large extent the first response of the Soviet authorities to the virus and to the growing epidemic. And the first force was Cold War propaganda, and generally the figure of the Cold War. And so I wanted to ask you, Ira, could you comment on that? Why is it, and generally the United States and the Cold War are very prominent in the book. So could you comment on that and explain why it is productive to think about or to analyze the first years of HIV in the Soviet Union in relation to the United States?
Of course, thank you. Well, as you know, the first case of HIV was detected in the US in 1981, and of course it was like the news were pretty much everywhere, and of course the Soviet authority decided to use it, of course. Yeah, the Soviet propaganda wrote about HIV as a Western virus. And I think it's pretty much like, it's very predictable, right? Nothing new, because the Soviet authorities used misconceptions, propaganda, even before HIV, right? Starting the 1970s, starting in the 1960s, 1970s. So nothing new for me, at least. I found nothing new in that. But what is interesting is that when I read letters of that ordinary people written to the Soviet authorities or newspapers or journalists, I found out that people did not buy this propaganda anymore. They did not trust it. When like some of Soviet medical practitioners were trying to persuade Soviet people that, okay, this Western virus would not come to the Soviet Union, people did not believe them. And we can see it, you know, throughout the texts. So people were worried, people were terrified, people did not trust Soviet authorities, they did not trust official information. And actually, I think that this propaganda about HIV as a Western virus, I think this propaganda triggered even more interest and in the Soviet people about HIV, and distrust, triggered more distrust. So yeah, I guess that Soviet propaganda was not persuasive in the late 1980s, and for me it was kind of one of the major revelations for me was that Soviet people did not trust, and they demanded for information, they demanded for knowledge. It's kind of interesting because we can see that Soviet people were not like passive at all.
But you also write very interestingly about how people in the Soviet Union regarded the threat of the virus as a general threat, and that you contrasted with the reaction of the U.S. American population to the threat of the virus. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I guess that was the second major revelation. Well, when we start talking about this book, the book project Katya, and we try to kind of discuss our perspectives on this topic, Katya talked a lot about, first of all, about stigma, and secondly, about the inability of the Soviet welfare system to effectively battle HIV. And I realized that I'm interested in completely different perspective, in completely different view on HIV, because stigma was pretty much everywhere where the virus emerged, right? Stigma existed in the US in the 1980s, stigma existed here in the 1980s, obviously in the UK. Of course, stigma existed in the Soviet Union. What was interesting for me that in the Soviet Union, and we can see it through the letters again, the HIV was perceived by Soviet people, by very different Soviet people, by young mothers, by World War II veterans, by young professionals as the mutual threat. In the US, HIV, at least at the earliest stages of its development, was perceived differently, as a threat to homosexuals, mainly. And we know from the historiography very well, because the historiography on HIV in the States is huge and very well developed. We know that medical practitioners spent a lot of money and time to persuade American people that HIV posed a threat to everybody, right? And what I see in the Soviet Union is that Soviet state had an advantage, because Soviet people realized that it's a threat for all of us, not just for homosexual people, but for young mothers, as I said, for a different group of people, for the Soviet people in general. One of the reasons, of course, as I think, is the socialist framework. Because people knew that the free healthcare system, right, state-supported healthcare system, and I think that Soviet people shared this idea of health as a mutual benefit, right? Secondly, the second, I guess, difference is that Soviet people realized that there is no private medicine in the Soviet Union, right? And if HIV is there, everybody would be affected, right? So it's a major difference in perception of HIV, I guess, in the States and in the Soviet Union. And again, for me, it was one of the main revelations that Soviet Union had certain advantage, which, of course, I guess slipped in the late 1980s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But yeah.
Thank you. And this is probably a good moment to speak about the other force that I mentioned, and that would be in the delay, that played a huge role in the delay in the Soviet authorities' response to the virus, and that is the Ministry of Health. So on the one hand, we have a ministry that has been designed, and you write wonderfully about it in a separate chapter, a ministry that is designed to combat viruses and to universal vaccinations in the Soviet Union were obligatory, and yet in the case of HIV, they completely fail. Could you explain that, or how do you explain that in the chapter?
So the HIV was under the third main directorate of the Ministry of Health. It was a kind of a special secret department, and at least what I found from 1983 till 1985, there was only one article published. So they control all the information, and there were lots of papers that said there was one of the main figure of this kind of censorship was Pyotr Burgasov, who was Deputy Minister of Health and then Minister of Health, and he was a Stalinist, kind of a homophobe, and he deeply believed in the idea. I don't know, I mean, but it's you can say from the secondary sources, he deeply believed that the Soviet society has a kind of a moral values and moral standards, and these standards and values will protect the Soviet society against the virus. So because there is a very famous case, and there are several cases, so most of the articles that was that was written by a Soviet scientist or journalist were sent to the Ministry of Health. Without the permission, at least until 1988, there were no chance to publish an article about HIV/AIDS. So most of the press were, it was a kind of a system of censorship. And there are several documents On one of them, Burgasov personally wrote kind of there was an article written by Zbarovsky, Evgeny Zbarovsky, a researcher, who said in the article that somehow American researchers realized that HIV/AIDS could be conducted by not only by people who have kind of antisocial style of life, but also by general citizens and general public. And Burgasov wrote no, and he also wrote kind of if the author thinks that homosexuals are normal, then the author is right. So this was his main idea, and he wrote several comments on the several papers which somehow wanted to elaborate this moment that it's a kind of a general threat. So that's why they had this idea in their head, and they also published a very famous kind of an interview where Burgasov said that we don't have a social base for spreading the HIV/AIDS because we have like one-to-one article, which means the criminalization of homosexuality, so the relationship between two men, and we have high moral standards.
So this is the personal factor, but could you say more about the state in which the Soviet health system was at the end of the 80s? And maybe you could talk a bit about the outbreaks in the outbreaks of HIV in Soviet hospitals in several cities, and why this happened.
Sure. So they started to work on HIV/AIDS in, I think, as early as 1983. So they realized in Moscow that even though they in publicly they speak about moral values, blah blah blah, all these things, and scientists, they realize that they need to do something. They need to invent they need to do a research, but the system itself was underfunded since Brezhnev. And in the middle of 1980s, Soviet Union doesn't have disposals. Doesn't have single-use needles for everything, for IV, for basically for everything, and there are lots of stories about this. So that's why this outbreak in Elista, in the center of the Republic of Kalmykia, happened when more than 30 children contracted the virus. So they contracted it because of due to the contaminated needles, because the system was underfunded, and because they don't have most of the medical personnel, they don't have time to clean the needles. They don't have time. They had one needle for 10 children. Yeah, and
there were no disposable syringes.
Right? Yeah, there were no disposable syringes. Yeah. So that's why it was kind of unavoidable. Yeah, to get this, and at the same time, the Burgasov had an enormous impact on this, an enormous impact on continuing on maintain the censorship. Yeah, because as I traced, the first proper academic article started to publish between 1985 and 1984. It was like 2 per year. Yeah, and then in 1986, Burgasov left the office, and he continued to give in a kind of a public speeches, and continued to speak about that HIV is not a threat for Soviet Union, but at least the Ministry of Health started to realize that they need to do something with the censorship, and the amount of the professional articles raised dramatically. Yeah, but it was too late at that time.
And could you speak a bit more about the local, regional, republic efforts in combating the virus, the spread of the virus? I mean, on the one hand, you write about outbreaks in some regional centers. Were there more positive examples or constructive examples as to how people reacted, so to say, outside of the center?
So first of all, we need to understand that there was a vertical system. So they even published a kind of instruction for all the centers, for all the hospitals in 1987, which had a kind of a steps. So if you suspect that someone has a kind of HIV or someone has a virus, you need to call to that person need to call that person, and that person need to call to the Ministry of Health immediately. So so they kind of there are several documents which have been sent to the Ministry of Health saying that, could you please give us an opportunity to work with our patients, because mostly local hospitals and local doctors, they don't have an opportunity to work with the blood samples. They were immediately, most of them should be immediately sent to Moscow, to the central laboratory, and they don't have an opportunity to work with patients. So, and the first public letter, which was kind of an informational letter number 1, was published in the end of 1988. They knew already that the outbreak in Elista happened, and they finally decided to publish the letter, which was specifically sent to all hospitals around Soviet Union. So yeah, and they started to systematically to inform people about HIV/AIDS and specificity of the virus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Perhaps a question for Ira, or would you like to add something? No. So you already sort of mentioned that there was a difference in how the authorities responded to the virus in the 80s and then in the 90s. That's what you implied, at least. So could you speak more about that? What happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, and what was going on with Yeltsin in Yeltsin's Russia in this regard?
Well, we specifically did not address that period of time. We worked with the documents related to the late Soviet Union, but I think that I can answer that question. I think that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously Western practitioners, medical practitioners, humanitarian aid, Western specialists, they came to the Soviet Union and they could come freely, right? There were no obstacles anymore. So in terms of professionalism, obviously, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the situation had greatly improved. And there was a very intense exchange of knowledge between Western, American doctors and Soviet doctors. But in terms of, I guess, perception of HIV problem, obviously, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at least in Russia, HIV was not perceived as a main problem in Russian post-Soviet society, because the failed economy, the political crisis, the first war in Chechnya started. So obviously the HIV was not that important, I guess, in the early 1990s. And yeah, I think that there was more attention to HIV in the late Soviet Union than in post-Soviet Russia. Let's put that this way, yeah.
Okay, let's go.
May I add a bit? I would say in 1990s, in perspective of 1990s, yes, you're absolutely right, that there were more intentions during the Soviet Union to understand that than in 1990s. But in 2000s, the situation it changed a bit differently. But I conducted several interviews with, I can't say the names, I mean, in the sake of the people are still in Russia. So, but they told me a story that how Last Sky, for instance, it's a very famous HIV foundation, came to Russia in 1990s. They came to drag queen community and asked them to help to enter clubs. And the managers and directors of the club say that, no, we don't need this kind of atmosphere, we don't need this fear, so we are having fun here. And they said, can we do something, at least put some condoms on the table in the corner, or and we will be quiet, and we are not going to interfere your, your parties. And this is how they, at least they entered the club scene in Moscow. So they specifically through the drag queen community and the lesbian community, they helped them to. To keep in, they put them in touch with managers and directors and persuaded them to do this kind of work because they were really against it.
Let's go back to the late 80s and speak, because I know you've prepared some interesting slides to show to the people. Let's speak about the role of the media in this crisis, and namely the visuality. How did the media represent the HIV/AIDS visually?
Okay, so there is a chapter on the media and HIV in our book, but this chapter is written by Katya. We also, I would like to show you some visual stuff. Some of the posters were reproduced in the book. But I guess not all of them. So I guess you can look at these posters, and I think that there was a journalist, David Tuller, who traveled to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and one of his observations is that all posters related to HIV, they were all intimidating and threatening. And he said that for him it was kind of unusual and paradoxical, because in the States, the posters related to HIV threat, they were they conveyed a different message. Sympathy, promise of help, and I don't know, kindness, I guess. And if you look at the Soviet posters, you will see that the message, the pictures are very, the visuality is different, but the message is pretty much the same. HIV is threat. You will die if you are having sex outside of marriage, the posters aimed at the posters pretty much, they are threatening, right?
They use fear, definitely.
And this poster is not threatening, obviously, and I can explain why. Because this poster was not published in the Soviet press, and this poster was not reproduced in the Soviet press. These posters was sent to the exhibition organized in the States. So that's why the message is quite different, right? So you can see Soviet aesthetic, we can battle HIV, but this is, as I said, this is the only case of not positive perception, of not threatening perception of HIV. And finally, another example of poster dedicated to HIV threat, the Russian one, right? And again, вышел на охоту, я тоже спит. Again, the threat. And look at the posters, and look at the photo I made in Bristol last year. Quite different message, right? HIV, zero risk. You can compare these two pictures, and you can see that HIV is perceived differently, obviously. In 2025 in Russia, it's still the main idea about HIV, that it's the threat. And you have to be, you have to be aware. And And here you can see that the message is quite different zero risk. Yeah, people taking HIV medication cannot pass on the virus. Again, interesting, in my opinion, kind of interesting comparison. Yeah.
Thank you. Katya, would you like to add something?
About
Perhaps you could speak a bit about the
press?
generally, not the visual, but the,
Yeah.
how the press reacted.
I mean,
to it.
in 1985, Gorbachev introduced perestroika and glasnost, openness, and in 1995, Minister of Health introduced the special decree which says we need to share, we need to first of all create more information about HIV/AIDS, and we need to share this information with people. But they said that all the tax should be approved by the Minister of Health. So kind of a so they control the press, I think, until 1987, until first publicly announced death, and they created a kind of a message. So in the USA, in America, the main message from above was that HIV/AIDS equal homosexuality. The main message created by the Soviet bureaucrats was HIV/AIDS kind of a anti-Soviet behavior. So they didn't, mostly medical bureaucrats, that's what I noticed, they didn't use the kind of a political notion of at-risk groups. They use antisocial behavior. So it was connected to the Soviet healthcare in general, because the patient in the Soviet healthcare was represented as a kind of a failure. You did something wrong, so that's why you catch a cold, I don't know, or contracted HIV. So, and they constantly use this antisocial behavior, perversive relations, so this kind of markers in order to identify people. And they also abuse the images of sex workers, foreigners, and people who are using drugs, and homosexuals. So it was kind of the opening line, like we know about HIV/AIDS, and we know that mostly HIV/AIDS is a virus that can be contracted by homosexuals, sex workers, foreigners, and people who are having a unhealthy lifestyle. These kind of things.
Perhaps you could also talk a bit about the case of Olga G, because I find it really fascinating how the media worked there.
Yeah, but it was until 1987. In 1987, the local Leningradskaya Pravda, the Leningrad newspaper, published and announced that the first Soviet citizen died because of HIV/AIDS. So the diagnosis was made post-mortem, yeah, and it was made post-mortem, and what I found 3 publications. So first one was published, let's say, in October, another one in November, and another one in December. In the first one, the journalist said, so police and neighbors of Olga G said that she was involved in a kind of a relationship, mostly with the foreigners. So, and police warned her, but nobody stopped her. So, in the second publication, she was represented as a prostitution and a woman with secrets, with clients, mostly foreigners. In the third one, it was a conversation with the new Deputy Minister of Health. The journalist just said that this dead prostitution, and that's it. So this is how they created facts. And this is how they created kind of an image of the person with HIV.
Thank you. Yeah. And before we open the floor for questions, I would like to ask one more question. And while reading the book, I couldn't help but notice that its protagonists were mostly men. And it's not surprising, because lots of people at the top in the Soviet Union were male. Valentin Pokrovsky, Pyotr Burgasov, Vadim Parkovsky, and so on and so forth. The list goes on. And in addition to Olga G, invoked in the context that you've just described, there was one person whom I noticed immediately, because she keeps reappearing in the book, Alla Alava. Could you talk about her?
Yeah, it was a period after 19. Was beginning in 1988. Огонек journal was kind of a perestroika, pro-democratic journal. They started to change the discourse. So I mean, it was very centralized from our point of view. Yeah, but the Огонек was quite popular among people outside of Moscow, and. So Alova started to publish articles and started to publish quite controversial texts about HIV/AIDS, and she started to conduct interviews with Pokrovsky, who was against, at that time, both of them was against the measures that were applied by the Ministry of Health, and they started to problematize the issue with HIV in the Soviet Union, and she also she realized the situation with disposals, a kind of a critical situation with disposals in Russia, and came to Red Cross and asked them to help. So she said, like, let's ask Alla Borisovna Pugacheva to give a tour and to collect money. And they said, no, we cannot do this kind of things. We're helping Africa. We cannot just, we have an image. Everything is all right with us. I mean, like, we cannot do this kind of things. And at the same time, the terrible earthquake happened in Armenia. And they said, we are very preoccupied. And she was like, okay. And founded an Огонек Foundation and started to collect money. And this is also a very, very interesting fact that lots of Soviet people decided to help to collect money, but they collecting them only for children, and this is important. So, but Alova wasn't furious all the time. I mean, like her text was full of this emotions. Yeah, emotions that she said that they don't understand. She constantly called people in the Ministry of Health and asked them, what are they doing? How do they? What are they going to do with the lack of condoms in the Soviet Union? Do they have a plan? So, and it was one of the. She's very inspiring female figure, but only from my point of view, she was the one who kind of founded and created something that. We can call it a kind of activism,
and like an alternative response.
An alternative response, yeah.
But we don't know who she is, right? Alla Alova. I mean, it's not her real name, and we don't know. Yeah, but actually, you missed. I guess, Andrei, you said that the book is very male focused, but you missed one of the heroes, female heroes, Aza Rakhmanova, who was, I think that I write in one of the chapters of my chapters about her. So she was a senior medical practitioner. I think that she was in her 60s, I guess, in the 1980s, and she was one of the very prominent, a pioneer of anti-HIV movement, right? She was one of the first. Doctors who established the HIV laboratory in Leningrad at the time, and she was outspoken, and she was very famous in the community. And Katya, you mentioned before that the Soviet medical practitioners, especially senior medical practitioners, they were all like very conservative people, homophobic people, but there are other examples actually, and I think that we have to remember that the picture is not black and white, and Aza Rakhmanova is one of them. And in her book of memoir, she writes that one of the reasons, one of the triggers, one of the reasons of her interest to the HIV problematic was the fact that her father was repressed during the Great Terror in the 1930s, and she knew exactly what does it mean to be isolated from society, to be alone, right? To be alone among the people. And that's why when she learned about HIV, she decided that it will be a focus of her medical effort. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
I talked about only medical bureaucrats. Most of them, there was another even male figures who tried to. They were also, most of them were homophobic, but they were tried at least. Yeah, it was it's a general thing, but they tried to raise the question of ineffective measures and to to fight against these measures and to have a kind of a public discussion. And criticize openly the Ministry of Health. Yeah. But Azar became the key figure in the HIV/AIDS movement in 1990s. Yeah.
Thank you. And now I think we'll open the floor for questions. You have the chance to ask. Mm-hmm.
Is anybody first? Okay.
So, excuse me. In the UK, there was quite a drive in the mid-80s on for extensive condom use and extensive advertising campaigns in the national papers. Some of them quite witty and saucy, actually. I just wondered if there was any sort of equivalent of that in the Soviet Union, and if so, when did it come in?
Yeah, so Oliver raised this question actually. So they constantly, and Igor Kohn, who was the first kind of a public figure who decided to talk about sex education and sexuality, and so they talked about this constantly. They talked about the lack of the sex education, the lack of the ads connected to sex education, but it was not in priority in terms of the Ministry of Health. Until the 1991, they were speaking about family morality and all these things. So there are documents. So they tried to build a kind of a new line at one of the factory in order to produce more condoms, but they failed because they didn't have any money and they didn't have any Western. The stuff that you need, to build a line in order to produce a certain amount of condoms for the huge country. And they realized it only in 1989. It was too late. Yeah, and so that's why they got back to the idea of the family and continued to promote the idea of the family. Yeah.
You were saying about I haven't read the book, but you were saying about the differences between the states where it was kind of homosexuals virus, and that Russia from very early stage was saying about the threat to the whole population. How much of that you think was actually the political decision? So there were no homosexuals in Russia, so, well, officially, so you couldn't have a homosexual virus. So that's my kind of first question. And my other question was about what you were saying about the narrative. And how much do you think that narrative difference between the Western world and Russia was determined by the fact that actually the sex education and the gay rights were much more advanced in the West than they were in Russia? So they kind of determined that narrative. I hope I make any sense in my questions, but
about the difference between the government and the society. I think society in general was also quite homophobic. I mean, like Soviet society was quite homophobic, and so they in the beginning until 1987, they built a kind of a public image of HIV as a foreign threat. So this is how they use the idea of the homosexuality. It was a political transition anyway. They built it around the Cold War ideas. Yeah, and mostly the text which were published until 1988 basically started like this. I mean, like we know that there is an HIV/AIDS and like millions of people in the US, mostly prostitutes, homosexual, and drug users contracted the virus. So, and they kind of they were emphasizing this idea that everything is all right here, and the situation is terrible in the Western world. And the first article that was published, that was written by Zhdanov, who was really good scientist. I mean, like from the very beginning, he was opposed to the Ministry of Health, but he was a Soviet person, and I think he truly believed that the sexual revolution was one of the key problem in terms of spreading the virus. And in 1985, just before the Festival of the Youth, which was a very political kind of event when Soviet Union invited students from Africa, from different kind of African countries, to come to Moscow and to have a kind of a festival. So it was a very political idea. So he published this article, and it was intended to publish before festival. And he wrote that like most of the people shouldn't worry about this because they are heterosexual, they have families, and they have morals. So, and it was a kind of an opposition between West and East. So, but I don't know anything about kind of a homosexual activism and grassroots.
Well, grassroots activism existed in the Soviet Union, especially in the late Soviet Union in 1950s, in the late 1980s, and one of the chapters is dedicated to this, to the emerging queer activism in the late Soviet Union, and HIV was, of course, one of the triggers for development of this activism. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. You talked a lot about how HIV provoked some cultural and social phenomenon in late USSR, but have you looked at the angle how HIV actually, how some cultural and social phenomenon affected the spread of the HIV? I'm from Belarus, and I just note one interesting legend that HIV spread not only in big cities like capital, but in some random small mono city. And I have a legend about it. It was really random, just because there was a lot of mineral resources, and then people from Leningrad with lots of money came there. They were so bored. And this is a legend, yeah. So have you ever touched upon this angle or looked at it, or? I'm not sure, to be honest, when the situation in this city developed after Soviet Union or during, but just, yeah.
But Sasha Arhipova, I think, in one of her book, wrote about the rumors which was spreading, like with the needles that people put into the cinema theaters, and so it was. I think it was a kind of a response, a psychological response to the threat, because at the late Soviet Union in 1989, 1988, so it was obvious that the virus is inside Soviet Union, and of course people were not idiots. I mean, they saw, some of them even refused to be vaccinated because they were really afraid of getting the virus after this Olga G case. Yeah, and this was a kind of a rumors that was spread around, and I also was, I heard them in 1990s, they were really popular in 1990s. And in 1990s, for instance, some of my friends who came to Moscow and then came back to my small town said, like, people are afraid of using metro because there are some people who are, kind of having needles and trying to, fuck people, and I mean, it was everywhere, yeah. And I think it was a kind of a response to this fear, to at least to have a kind of a picture, because there was still not a lot of information about this. Not a lot of people knew about this. I mean, like if you live in Moscow, okay, if you live in a big city like, I don't know, Nizhny Novgorod, somewhere else, yeah. But if you live in a small town, I don't know, in 300 kilometers from Moscow, 600 kilometers from Moscow, maybe you've never ever heard about HIV, because you don't read Speed Info, for instance. And it was really difficult to actually to get the newspaper. And I found one of the letter written by the guy who lived in St. Petersburg and said that, like, in St. Petersburg, so the newspaper cost one ruble, and in St. Petersburg, people, smugglers, they sold it for 2 rubles, and he was complaining about this and said, like, could you please put a big sticker or like anything with the price on it, because it's devastating that it's really difficult to find the newspaper, and now it costs 2 rubles, and it's really or was expensive, I should say.
Could you maybe, what I was also interested in, could you maybe say a bit more about Speed Info, and why was it created, by whom, and when it was AIDS Info, and then at some point it became Speed Info, why?
I mean, it was created, as I've already told, it was created by kind of a Milosierdia Foundation, by Pokrovsky and by Vladimir Posner, who at that time was a very famous Soviet journalist, and they created this newspaper, and the editor of this paper, so they went to the Central Committee in order to ask the permission to open the newspaper, and of course committee wanted to control the topic of sexuality, and they thought, that's what the editor-in-chief said, they thought if they will open one newspaper, they still would have a control, because it's just one newspaper. So, and the first issue was published in the end of 1989. Was, I don't know, let's say like 10,000 or 100,000 copies, and in 1990s was the print run was around, I don't know, 1 million, 2 million, or something like this. Yeah.
I do have a question about kind of cultural representation of that in the Soviet media, because in 1989 a cult late Soviet classic Inter Девочка came out. And just to give context to those people who haven't seen it, it has a scene of police interrogation of prostitutes, and their handbags are inspected, and one of the handbags contains lots of condoms, to which the response of the prostitute is, well, you know, there is an AIDS epidemic out there, and we are going hand in hand with the Soviet Ministry of Healthcare protecting this. What's your take on this specific portrayal of the problem of AIDS in
relation to sex workers, or
in relation to not just sex workers but generally?
Yeah, but I do remember in the in this documentary film, a risk group, they interviewed prostitutes and in one of the police department, and it was devastating because they covered their faces. And there was another one which was broadcasted on the Soviet TV when the prostitute said like this, camera was like this, and it was like, I don't have AIDS. I disappointed you, I'm really sorry, but I don't have it, you know. And they were given interviews, and it was very bold. They were given interviews like, I don't want to have another life because I have mom, because I have a daughter somewhere in, I don't know, in the small city, and I need to earn money. And I don't know how to earn money because I'm working at the factory, and it's nothing. So that's why I decided to become a sex worker. I was fascinated by the boldness and, you know, like the power that they had, and the interview they gave. Yeah, but Interdevchka was a pure scandal, like.
But it was massive scandal.
Yeah, it was massive scandal.
What's interesting because the creators of that film managed to sneak the topic of AIDS into the film. In one scene.
Yeah, I guess that it's not that surprising because, as Katya said before, HIV was discussed on Soviet TV starting like 1987, 1988. Yeah. Of course, we all know Interdevchka, right? Because it's such a great movie, and this movie has focused on like new topics, right? Like old topics, but new topics for the Soviet viewer. But we know much less about Soviet TV at the time. And I was able to, as I said before, and I think that we write about it in a book, there were many different documentaries, TV programs, TV shows dedicated to HIV, homosexuality, prostitution. So all those topics were discussed on Soviet TV, but we know much less about it than, I don't know, about Interdevchka, for example, right? So, yeah.
There was a very popular TV show before and after midnight. It was very popular because they broadcast in the American musical clips and you know, these kind of things. Yeah, but as far as I remember, there was only one interview, like 5-minute interview with Vadim Pokrovsky, and it was about HIV. And they gave them 5 minutes. The host of the show asked him, like, you just released several people with HIV from your hospital. What can you say about this? And he was like, they are not in prison. They are not prisoners. I mean, like, they are allowed to go out. And the host was made like, I don't know, you know, rest bitchin' face, and they continued the conversation, you know. But he said about condoms on TV in 1988, and the guy who created the show in his book remembered that it was a huge scandal in the Central Committee because they said the word condom on the Soviet TV, and they were called to the Central Committee and said, like, what are you doing? Even though they were broadcasting all this sexually, full of sexuality, yeah, so, American musical videos, yeah.
Just before we hear another question, we are being watched online, and I wanted to ask whether we have any questions there. Just to give up. No, okay, well, then you're welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It was so good. And I'm really excited to read the book. On a personal note, I have the book because my babushka smuggled it from Russia as a to here as a birthday present for me. So I haven't read it yet, but she's very woke. I wanted to ask about you talk about the USSR, but it's quite kind of Russia-centered, obviously, because that's where the data is, I think, coming from. But can you say anything about the rest of the USSR? What was happening maybe in Central Asia or the Caucasus? And what is the information? Kind of piggybacking off of the Belarus question a little bit, what was happening outside of Russia? I
have a collection of articles which was published in Soviet Estonia, and some of them in Narvsky Rabochi, so kind of in Estonian newspapers. And in 1989, they started to publish the articles or interviews with the epidemiologist, Republican epidemiologist, who was saying that we have to stop being hypercritical and to start to introduce sex education to teenagers. So they were quite ahead of the Russian Soviet Republic. Yeah, and I think in Latvia they're also the first interview actually with one of the quite an honest one. Published with the director of the AIDS Center in 1988, which was a Latvian AIDS center. And in it, the director of the center said that until 1987, it was abandoned to speak publicly about HIV/AIDS. So kind of it was 1988. I don't know, but it was politically it was a really bold statement from our point of view. Yeah, and I know that they after the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of the, especially Baltic republics, they introduced sex education and they started to change the visual narrative. So it became very friendly, very welcome. It was specifically focused on young generation. So, but they started it in 1989. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Olga, for your question. Yeah, your babushka is great. You know, yes, the book is titled The Outbreak, HIV in the Late Soviet Union. And of course, I expected to hear the question about, like, are you talking about Soviet Union or are you talking about Russia? Of course, and I think that still the title is justified because in the late 1980s, the HIV problem was mostly discussed on the federal level. And sometimes it's just difficult to separate like Russia from, I don't know, from Ukraine in terms of HIV treatment and HIV measures. But I think that there is a subsection in one of the chapters about Ukraine because, of course, you all know about the Chernobyl disaster occurred in 1986 in April. And it's interesting that in the Ukrainian society, there was a phrase coined, the phrase about Chernobyl HIV. Obviously, in terms of science, it's like invalid conception, right? But many people were persuaded that immune system of Ukrainians is weakened by the HIV or by the Chernobyl disaster, right? And it actually helped decriminalize homosexuality in Ukraine. In Soviet Ukraine, Ukraine was the only Soviet state, the only Soviet republic, one out of 15, where homosexuality was decriminalized before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because in Russia, it was decriminalized homosexuality was decriminalized in 1993. In Ukraine, homosexuality was decriminalized in 1991, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and many medical practitioners who were involved in this work, they remember that it was easier for them lobbying the decriminalization because of this Chernobyl HIV. So.
There is also a narrative about the establishment of AIDS centers. And I found several articles or documents that said that the local authorities failed to establish a center in Bishkek because the local authorities said they're not going to provide a water for the center, and then the state telephone company said they're not going to provide a connection for them. So it was a kind of maybe they were afraid of us. I mean, like the society in general were afraid of establishing the center. And I also have the story about the Odessa, that the center was established next to the station where they store all the blood samples. And the director of the station said that we're not going to do this kind of things and close the center. And this is how and then they reopen it only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in republics, especially in Central Asia, it was really difficult to open these AIDS centers. I think in 1989, 1990s, yeah.
Hello. Just to kind of piggyback on what Ira said, about Chernobyl. Another factor that, of course, defines Soviet experience of the late 80s is the war in Afghanistan. And I wonder how kind of it connects to what you were saying about the Cold War. And famously there was a hepatitis epidemic among the contingent, and I imagine there were cases of HIV, AIDS there as well. And do you see any kind of cases of, I don't know, soldiers? Is it part of the public discussion, or is it completely, you know, kind of ignored and not really? There is no connection there, kind of in public discourse.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia, for your question. No, I know nothing about. Sorry about that. I know. I don't remember. I don't think that I saw any links between like HIV and Afghanistan in the late Soviet Union in press or in the documents. But what is interesting, I was able to find quite interesting source. It's a document from a CIA archive, because you know that CIA, they declassified a lot of the documents related to the US history and to the Soviet history. And there is a quite interesting document written by CIA experts in the late 1980s about the HIV spread in the Soviet Union. And according to this document, according to the assessment of people behind this report, they did not expect to see the development of epidemics in the Soviet Union. They believed that, they mentioned the criminalization of homosexuality. They also mentioned the low mobility of the population in comparison to the US. So yeah, it's like, I guess it was quite surprising to see that even American experts did not see like a huge threat that HIV can possibly bring to the Soviet population. And of course, they did not expect to see the Soviet Union dissolved. So yeah, and this, I think that I cite this document in the book, so you can find it there. Yeah, thank you.
About distribution of these posters, because they were intended for public spaces, so where could one see them, because they were pretty spicy.
Some of them were published in the newspapers, in the all union newspapers, so everybody could have access to it. And some of them, like this funeral rove, which was said like from the Soviet people to the Minister of Health. It was artistic work that was exhibited during in 1991, I think, in Moscow. But as far as I remember, Speeding 4 created several kind of a championship or something like this. Yeah. So you write a poster, create a poster, send it to us, and we will choose. I don't know, 5. Best 5, and we will publish them, and they indeed published several of them in the Speeding 4. Yeah.
Yes, so actually I think it can be a really good topic for a PhD dissertation, because the visual material is very rich, and we have not analyzed posters. We reproduced some of them, but there are so many of them. As Katya just said, the Ministry of Health, the magazines, they organized like competitions among the artists. So you can find a lot of them in the archives. You can find a lot of posters in Goskatalog, if you know what it is. So it's a Russian catalog of museum objects. And there are so many posters, some of them published in the press, some of them were on display in, I don't know, in like pretty much everywhere at the time. And some of the posters were not published, but you still can find them online. So the visual material is very rich, but the message is the same.
I think, I mean, as you said, Katya, they're going to stay here. You can ask your questions after we close this panel. And I would like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the authors for buy the book.